My name is Amir Yusuf. I am one of Miss Alexandria students, and I'm studying art at the Faculty of Fine Arts. And I've joined Miss Alexandria since 8 months ago, and I've been working and experimenting in all forms of art because it's like I always come up with a profound experience through these experiments. So it's really interesting for me. And today, I am really glad, but a little bit sad, yeah. First, I'm glad because in these last 4 days, for us in Miss Alexandria students, we had like, it's more than an incredible pleasure to have you all here in Alexandria, really. And we really enjoyed everything, and every single hour, and every discussion, and every thoughts, and every talks. And we all would like to thank you for your time here, and it was like a branch for the Community 13 here in Alexandria, and we really wish you could stay more with us. So I really hope that we could stay in contact, so maybe we could share with you our experiments, our ideas, so maybe we could give us some feedback or something. So really thank you. And I'm a little bit sad because tomorrow will be the last day for the seminar. And I hope you really enjoyed with us, yeah. So thank you all. And also, today I'm really honored to present the co-founder and director for the Contemporary Art Forum for Alexandria, ACAF. And it's a non-profit art space that has been in operation since December 2005. Today he's going to give us a lecture entitled of Rabbits and Dragons, but a little bit I would like to mention that he recently turned his attention to developing and performing a series of dramatized lectures entitled FOXP2, in which he delivered his text to the sound of musical beats generated by the New York-based beat boxer Kenny Mohammed. So please enjoy the talk with Bassam El-Baroni, and I hope you give him a hand. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to start off by a round of thanks for everybody who made this seminar possible, the Documenta 13 team, Sarah Rifki, of Circa and the soon-to-be launched institution Beirut, Daniel Stovesand of Goethe, and Diana Ross King of Mass. During the preparations that led up to this event, Sarah was pushing me, in the positive sense of the word, to come up with a title for this talk. It was basically a matter of 48 hours, so it was quite difficult to come up with a title for something so mosaic-like as this talk in such a hurry. I remember visualizing Sarah's baffled expression as she read the title I had chosen of Rabbits and Dragons in the email I sent her. So I think I owe a quick explanation as to what this title points towards. Many of you might be familiar with the expression doves and hawks. Popular in the political terminology of the United States, doves and hawks are terms applied to people based upon their views about military conflict. A dove is someone who opposes the use of military pressure to resolve a dispute. A hawk favors entry into war. The terms came into widespread use during the Vietnam War, but their roots are much older than that conflict, of course. This is related to the transcultural age-old practice of anthropomorphism, or personification, which is the attribution of human characteristics, or characteristics assumed to belong only to humans, to animals, non-living things, phenomena, objects, organizations, governments, etc. I was looking for a complex anthropomorphism that could touch on the political moment of today as a kind of enigmatic key that is not at all about the binaries of evil and good. Baddies and goodies, Autobots and Decepticons, doves and hawks. But about the interplay of narrative characteristics from a long history we have all somehow been apprentices to, instantly igniting memories and associations. Through mythology and popular culture, we have come to know the dragon as a fictional and legendary creature, typically with serpentine and reptilian traits found in many cultures and narrative traditions. The English serpentine, the English word dragon derives from the Greek drakon, which means dragon, serpent of huge size, water snake, and which probably comes from the verb drakin, to see clearly. Generally speaking, the dragon is depicted as a non-questioning creature. It knows what it wants intrinsically, although it lacks intelligence. But this lack of intelligence is balanced. I'm sorry, this setup is a bit weird. Put it here, but. So, okay. Generally speaking, the dragon is depicted as a non-questioning creature. It knows what it wants intrinsically, though it lacks intelligence. But this lack of intelligence is balanced This lack of intelligence is balanced to a degree by its wisdom that perhaps is a result of its lack of intelligence. It is a powerful creature that can see clearly in that it rarely doubts and is rarely involved in ethical or moral problematics. The dragon represents bestiality as a form of wisdom, a noble beast that does not need to think. On the other hand, the rabbit is not a fictional creature, but a real animal that has been fictionalized only in order to become that creature that is unsure of what it wants, or a constantly doubting, questioning animal that is full of existential uncertainties. Whether running against a slow tortoise and losing, pondering confusingly in Alice and Wonderland, collectively struggling to find a new home and experiencing the hard lessons of peer brutality, struggles to survive and death along the way in the brilliant classic novel and film Watership Down, or becoming an iconic symbol for male sexual desire, the rabbit is always in the process of learning how to see clearly. An indecisive but intelligent creature that only gains wisdom through experience and places itself at the heart of many ethical and moral questions. These two characters are ever present on the social political spectrum, and it is between these two beasts that I use here as open-ended signifiers that the talk today will hopefully resonate as what Paul Ricoeur would call a limited field of possible constructions. These two characters are carriers and vessels of edification, a term I go into later in this paper. The rabbit and the dragon are carriers and vessels, hosts that permeate distinct traits that echo political, ethical, and social positions. It is also no coincidence that the years 2011 and 2012, in which the wave of protests in different parts of the world began and continue today, are the year of the rabbit and the year of the dragon, respectively, in the Chinese zodiac calendar. This talk was developed over a period of about 14 months in fragments, posts on Facebook, and debates with friends via Skype or email. These fragments have been threaded together to form this talk. For reasons having to do with limited time, I have selected 4 fragments to present today. One can see it as an attempt to make some sense of my life between 2 spaces and 2 times or speeds, the space and time speed of ongoing political revolt, particularly in Egypt, where I am attached on all levels, and between the space and time speed of art, in which I work, reciprocate, and attach myself for different reasons than the latter. The talk uses the structure of entries into a diary, but only as a structural device for arranging fleeting thoughts in development. Each entry has a specific title. Entry number 1. The title of entry number 1 is "The Center of Meaning is Empty." It's the early days, the first few days after Mubarak's removal as head of state. I am in a taxi, sitting next to the driver, taking me to where I work, ACAF, where I haven't been in over 2 weeks. He is driving down the Corniche, as it is called here, the long highwayish road running parallel to the Mediterranean. I am looking at my city out of the car window. I see hundreds of teenagers and young adults painting on the walls. What they are painting worries me a great deal. I take it as a sign for some misfortunes to come. One wall painting shows military officers holding an Egyptian flag out of a tank cockpit. The line, "The people of Egypt are victorious," is written on the top. The Egyptian flag's red, white, and black are painted everywhere, almost in every corner, even on the pavements. These kids are ruthless with the paintbrush. These are strong colors. They are noisy. They are making the bluish turquoise color of the sea less beautiful. I feel an excessive nationalism that is intrinsically tied to the military nature of the state. I say to myself, this revolution is not over. For the first time, I realize the importance of a term that is rarely used today. The term is edification. A quick dictionary search will tell you that edification means to instruct, especially so as to encourage intellectual, moral, or spiritual improvement. That it denotes an uplifting enlightenment that results in understanding and the spread of knowledge. I think edification posits a much more complex problem than ideology. How intellectual debate is structured today is basically polarized between 2 thought patterns that seem to predetermine how we think. So say if I were, just for example, Slavoj Žižek, I would always move towards the pole of ideology as being the main reason for our perplexed state of being. On the other pole, if I am a thinker, and this is in very generally speaking, whom is thought of as representing an other, an outside of what has been constructed as the continental tradition. Say, for example, someone like Tariq Ramadan, who is becoming more and more popular within contemporary art context for some reason. I would always move towards the pole of culture as being the main system that sorts out power relations and politics, etc. Of course, there have been many attempts recently to find systems of thought that can escape and construct other possibilities, or polarizations, if you like. Most notably, what has been termed as speculative realism or speculative materialism, object-oriented philosophy. Now, for me, the concept of a persisting edification that humanity cannot rid itself of, that we as humans have built the continuation of our existence in most societies on the idea of making life better, making better humans and better everything, is the cause for much fear and also the cause for much hope. The Berlin Biennial asks us to forget fear, but what I think is implicated is something like the statement, if you want to make the world better, life better, then you must forget your feelings of fear. But I think to do that, we must have hope in the notion of betterment. And here I must stress betterment is different from progress, because it transcends all ideologies and historic periods, and even religions. It seems to be the motive behind the development of life systems. What would religions do? What would politics do? What would education do if they did not seek to make better or make more efficient humans? Progress, on the other hand, is much more specific. One can define it as post-enlightenment betterment. But what if, for example, one did not have much hope in betterment as the main driving force behind thought? Derrida and Foucault, I think, exemplified this strain. But today it seems most thinkers are unable to build the foundations of their thought outside betterment, and thus edification. I think to place oneself outside of edification and betterment is a tactical move of the intellect. To do so, one must first have full doubt in the notion of hope, have no hope for hope. Why? Because what drives hope? Betterment. Hope usually takes me to Schopenhauer's famous definition of it, where he concludes, hope is the confusion of the desire for a thing with its probability. Hope is the confusion for the desire for a thing with its probability. And I first said this to Sarah in a discussion. Being an ontological subject of both, one, the never-ending season labeled the Arab Spring, and two, of an ambiguous and elastic entity labeled the art world, a frustrated hope is always around the corner. In many discussions, in both of those spaces. Hope is always just in many of those spaces and their intersections. If we look at Schopenhauer's definition closely, three words stick out: confusion, desire, and probability. There are many questions that instantly come to mind here, such as what exactly causes the confusion between the desire for a thing and its probability, and who or what has the effective power to declare something probable or improbable. I think these two questions are at the heart of what one is witnessing and going through on a daily basis while living in the intercutting planes of politics, daily life, and culture. I want to focus on the first of these two questions. What exactly causes the confusion between the desire for a thing and its probability? I think the most likely answer would be something like ideology, and I would probably disagree with that answer. I think what we witnessed, or still are witnessing in Egypt, in Syria, Bahrain, Greece, Spain, New York, and elsewhere, although extremely different, shares at least one thing, and I think that thing is the actual uncovering of what is actually behind ideology. The source of ideology, or ideologies in plural, if you like. So for me, I don't see that what people are grouping to declare independence from is ideology or established ideology, because these ideologies are already within the field of simulacra. Already failed with historic and contemporary proof of failure. For any act to mean something substantial today, it must bypass the question of ideology. I think what is slowly being reified and made concrete is that behind ideology, something that is, there lies something that is much more complex, and I would say archaic, something that is ancient, something that at first sight appears to be unexplainable. Join some Facebook groups of various political orientations, and you will be flooded with signs that bring into use everything from the leftist clutched fist to various religious symbols. Join these groups, for they exist almost everywhere, for almost every society. Through both the proliferation and the distribution of these signs and identities, and the systematic attempt to crush them, one begins to realize that what is slowly being revealed after the consistent use of ideological semiotics by the rebellious and their states alike, what is slowly being revealed is that behind ideology lies a whole complex history of something that we can call edification. In the 18th century, edification began to place itself at the crossroads of the epistemological and ontological thinking that was constructing the intellectual pillars of modernism in Europe. What edification seems to describe from that time onwards is the struggle between the individual's autonomy as a self with a will and his/her existence within and contribution to a larger community. This is the beginning of edification's interests in aesthetics, since aesthetics is a domain that is intrinsically connected to the idea of representation. And to think of a balance between the autonomy of the individual's will and the individual's functioning within a community, one must begin to think of representation. I think that what we are witnessing today is edification being laid bare, made naked, that what constitutes us as human beings is formed, at least in large part, by the sum of edification processes we have been through. This is exactly why the rebellious demand things, but actually have no ready alternatives for the systems they want to replace. If 1989 was the year when ideologies fell to the market, 2011 was the year when the market began to fall to reveal edification, to reveal something even more difficult to unpack than ideology, something that when we refuse, we are automatically refusing part of ourselves. I think Flaubert understood edification when he proclaimed, "It seems to me that I have always existed, and that I possess memories that date back to the pharaohs." In other words, how we relate to time and thus how we perceive the world is formulated by composite layers of edification processes that have formed both the modern and the contemporary human subject. Some of these processes remain vernacular, applicable to specific communities only. Others transcend the vernacular and reach most societies in the world through intellectual power, economic influence, or sheer force, of course. The young people painting tanks, flags, and soldiers in the early days of the revolution in Alexandria upheld the edification of Nasser and the military state, and sustained it in what was supposed to be its moment of death. It was only when some began realizing that their whole identities had been constructed on meanings that were empty at their center, a manufactured vernacular edification of 60 or so years, that the revolution really started. The center of the meaning of a nation's identity, and likewise of art, is always empty, always ready to be filled up by power or concept. Thus, the center of the meaning of a nation's identity of art only becomes a new identity or a new art when it is filled with ideas that can counteract older edifications without re-edifying its people or public. Until then, we live under the edification of the past. Entry number 2. The title of entry number 2 is Death, the Martyr, the Hero, and Art. Allow me to start this entry by quoting a long paragraph from Michel de Certeau's The Practice of Everyday Life. Quote, "The staff of a hospital withdraws from the dying man. The syndrome of withdrawal on the part of doctors and nurses. This distancing is accompanied by orders in a vocabulary that treats the patient as though he were already dead. He needs to rest. Let him sleep. It is necessary that the dying man remain calm and rest. Beyond the care and the sedatives required by the sick man, this order appeals to the staff's inability to bear the uttering of anguish, despair, or pain. It must not be said, the dying are outcasts because they are deviants in an institution organized by and for the conservation of life. An anticipated mourning, a phenomenon of institutional rejection, puts them away in advance in the dead man's room. It surrounds them with silence, or worse yet, with lies that protect the living against the voice that would break out of this enclosure to cry, 'I'm going to die.' This cry would produce an embarrassingly graceless dying. More than that, as a dead man on reprieve, the dying man falls outside the thinkable, which is identified with what one can do. In leaving the field circumscribed by the possibilities of treatment, it enters a region of meaninglessness. Nothing can be said in a place where nothing more can be done. Along with the lazy man, and more than he, the dying man, is the immoral man. The former, a subject that does not work, the latter, an object that no longer even makes itself available to be worked on by others. Both are intolerable in a society in which the disappearance of subjects is everywhere compensated for and camouflaged by the manipulation and multiplication of the tasks to be performed. Between the anguish of individuals and the administration of practices, the dying man raises once again the question of the subject at the extreme frontier of inaction, at the very point where it is the most impertinent and the least bearable. In our society, the absence of work is nonsense. It is necessary to eliminate it in order for the discourse that tirelessly articulates tasks and constructs the accidental story of there's always something to do to continue. The dying man is the lapse of this discourse." Unquote. Now, why am I making this point? Not just because there is a lot of death in the air, but because I think this concept of the dying man, as portrayed by de Certeau, is exactly the point at which the hero is born. Heroes are important, not of course in the sense of the Bonnie Tyler song, I Need a Hero, but in the sense that the concept of the hero is a crucial building block for both the maintenance and reconstruction of societal ideas and identities. In popular culture and film, the hero can be identified as he who holds the strength to not only survive entering the region of meaninglessness that Certeau mentioned, but to actually make meaning and reason of it. Take, for example, I Am Legend, a 2007 film featuring Will Smith. Smith stars as Dr. Robert Neville. He's a scientist who was unable to stop the spread of the terrible virus that was incurable and man-made. Immune, Neville is now the last human survivor in what is left of New York City, and perhaps the world. For 3 years, Neville has faithfully sent out daily radio messages, desperate to find any other survivors who might be out there. But he is not alone. Mutant victims of the plague, the infected, lurk in the shadows, watching Neville's every move, waiting for him to make the fatal mistake. Perhaps mankind's last and best hope, Neville is driven by only one remaining mission: to find a way to reverse the effects of the virus using his own immune blood. But he knows he is outnumbered and quickly running out of time. If you've seen the film, then you'll be familiar with its ending. It ends with Dr. Neville Will Smith's death, but before he dies, he manages to develop a serum, a cure for the virus, and give it to two people whom he has come across and who were also lonely survivors. The two went on to successfully find a small colony of survivors in a seemingly rural area far away from New York, and so life goes on through the death of Robert Neville. For me, the image in the film that struck me as most haunting was not that of spooky zombie-like virus-infected humans who progress out of the dark to devour each other, but it was this image of Will Smith and his dog roaming the vacant and lifeless streets of New York, with humanity long gone and nowhere to be seen. This recurrent image in the film, for me, signals the epitome and the climax of meaninglessness. It signals the point where there is no reason to carry on living, where the logical thing to do would be to have committed suicide. Even if you resisted, you would have probably come to that point in the end where it just becomes impossible to go on. But no, not only does Neville or Smith resist, it is he resisted, he actually goes on to give life, and this is the making of the hero in its most extreme scenario. Now the hero is gaining more importance in the space of the everyday and politics, and as a consequence in the space of culture and art. It comes to this context through a slightly different character, that of the martyr. In the early days of the now famous 18 January-February 2011 protests, artist Ahmed Bassiouni is killed by snipers. Egypt's small art community grieves online. In Tahrir Square, and in dusty neon-lit cafes. It's now June 2011. The artist's work is representing Egypt at the Venice Biennial. Video documentation of a performance piece by the artist has been re-edited to include footage of the artist in revolution on the night he was shot dead. Some critics affiliated with the state-run cultural circle attacked the pavilion. It is probably the first time that a young artist from without the ranks of the fine arts sector, the Visual Arts Division within the Ministry of Culture, has been awarded such a prestigious solo presentation. Whispered questions circulate. Why did the Ministry of Culture accept this proposal? Could it have something to do with the improvement of its image and thus the image of the state? In the end, most agree that it was a positive thing to have the martyr artist, as he is often referred to, represent Egypt at the biennial. Fast forward. We are now in November 2011. The martyr count is rapidly increasing, and the state seems to be an even worse version of what it once was, before the removal of Mubarak. It now has more instruments of repression and oppression. Revolutionaries are losing the sympathy of the majority of the nation. State media manipulation, engineered lawlessness, and economic hardship, and the divide and rule tactics administered by those in power have proven successful on the long run. In this climate, the martyr and the rights of martyrs become one of the few points of public empathy that still hold some strength in the media war between the revolution and the state. I remember an interesting revelation by Peter Sloterdijk from his book Rage and Time. Quote, "No modern human being can put himself back into a time where the concepts of war and happiness formed a meaningful constellation. For the first listeners of Homer, however, war and happiness are inseparable. The bond between them is founded upon the ancient cult of heroes. We moderns know this cult only within the square brackets of historical education. For the ancients, this heroism was no subtle attitude, but the most vital of all possible responses to the facts of life. A world without heroes would have been worth nothing in their view. Such a world would have meant a state in which human beings would have been exposed to the monarchy of nature without any resistance. I realize that the closest thing there is to an ancient hero in our time is the martyr. The very act of martyrdom, the suffering of death on account of adherence to a cause, especially if this cause is of a non-religious nature, is the only strong act of heroism available in an era where war and happiness cannot form a meaningful constellation. Martyrdom instantly renders criticism as skepticism by being ethically determinate, something criticism cannot afford. Perhaps the martyr comes closest to how Hannah Arendt describes the power of human action when she wrote, "Action is, quote, an ever-present reminder that men, though they must die, are not born in order to die, but in order to begin," unquote. A sentimental cliche, it could be, but that would take us into the next entry. But first, I'll have to complete this one. Martyrdom and its representation in the media within a revolutionary context can be seen as a response to the dehumanizing effects of late capitalism. and the vernacular list of partial and total tyrannies it has helped give rise to. For how else has been Bouazizi's self-immolation portrayed? However, it can also be argued that martyrdom is the ultimate act of dehumanization itself. By publicly annihilating oneself for a cause, the cause becomes greater than the self and makes the martyr's relationship to a wider anthropology of humanity that of a clog of sorts. Martyrdom's relationship to art has a long history, from the portrayals of the crucifixion to the endurance of performance art, of the 60s and 70s, and the more subtle disappearance of Bastian Adder. The difference is that our art is always seen as a compensatory cultural response, while martyrdom pays a very real price in the public imaginary. This is why art in a state of revolution suffers and is downgraded even more than it usually is, and even sometimes attacked by those who practice it, because it cannot compete with martyrdom. If we can all agree that art does not have to compete with martyrdom, then art would be fine. Entry number 3. And the title of entry number 3 is A Cliché is a Cliché is a Cliché. We are still in the month of November 2011. I'm preparing for a book launch event of a publication entitled 15 Ways to Leave Badiou. I'll quickly describe this publication. 15 artists, mostly based in Egypt and the Middle East, are invited to interact with Alain Badiou's 15 thesis on contemporary art, a lecture which he delivered at the Drawing Center in New York in 2003. The artists' responses are intertwined with Badiou's text. Reading from the publication's introduction, Alain Badiou's 15 thesis on contemporary art is the closest manifestation of ideas in which a living philosopher attempts to outline the laws, decrees, and protocols of contemporary artistic practice. From thesis 1 to thesis 8, Badiou rolls out a descriptive blueprint for contemporary art in which he clearly describes its general characteristics and the codified protocols it usually abides by. In order to be merited with the tag of contemporary. From thesis 9 to thesis 15, Badiou changes the blueprint, and his mission shifts from that of description and identification to that of the improvement and regulation of contemporary art and the advancement of a new order within the current order of things. This order is what Badiou dubs non-imperial art, contemporary art which is not in the service of empire. Around exactly the same time as the book launch, the so-called Battle of Mohammed Mahmoud Street erupted in Cairo, where a demonstration turned into a street fight between protesters and the Ministry of Interior. And also where a demonstration turned into a street fight between protesters and the Ministry of the Interior, and also a landmark in the relation between political groups, since it signals the actual end of attempts to form a unified political front for the uprising, an event where non-Islamists break up with Islamists and see them as betrayers of the cause. What was expected is engraved in the headlines of international news, without subtlety, a moment when subtlety falls, a moment when clichés circulate and nothing one can say can surpass their power. Very few people attend the book launch. Difficult times weigh on energy levels, and the general sense of lethargy is spreading like a virus. This uprising comes in waves of high and low. My friend and contributor to the publication, Suhail Malik, is in town to explain the ideas in his brilliant essay for the publication entitled Art and Universality Conflict, a didactic exposition of Badiou's 15th thesis on contemporary art. By now, I have read this essay a few times, and a certain part of it is beginning to bother me. It is the part where the writer uses the idea of the cliché to rebuke the various theses Badiou proposes. So, for example, if we take thesis number 2, art cannot merely be the expression of a particularity, be it ethnic or personal. Art is the impersonal production of a truth that is addressed to everyone. The writer describes this as the cliché that great art can touch anyone. Thesis number 9, for example, the only maxim of contemporary art is not to be imperial. This also means it does not have to be democratic, if democracy implies conformity with the imperial idea of political liberty. The writer describes this as the cliché that great art is an expression of a greater freedom, and so on, etc. The questions that I ponder on from that point on, questions I am unable to find solid answers to, are: does the idea that a certain point of view can be reduced to a cliché make it less valid? As Paul Ricoeur states, the logic of validation allows us to move between the two limits of dogmatism and skepticism. Thus, the trap for critical inquiry is to fall into patterns of mere validation and devalidation. After the disappointing book launch, I traveled to Zagreb. On the flight, I read a text by Louis Kamnitzer. Part of the text is dedicated to a rereading of René Magritte's work. I will read a passage in this text that reignited an interest in Magritte that I have not had since the days when I used to be a painter. Kamnitzer writes, quote, Magritte always interested me for two reasons. One is that in spite of his stellar place in the history of art, he was not a very good painter. He was, however, a very good artist. The point here is that a good artist does not have to paint well. He has to use paint well for his purpose. This may sound like being picky with words, but the explanation for this is that had he painted better than he did, his work would have been slick calendar stuff. And had he painted worse, he wouldn't have made it into the museum or the gallery. At least not during his time. In other words, he used painting just right. He found the perfect and very fragile point in which his imagery could survive the way it should. The packaging of his product is not too good or too bad. It is perfect and beyond evaluation. The other and more important reason for my attraction to Magritte, this is Louis Kamnitzer continuing, is how he handled nomenclature. Nomenclature is the practice of giving names to things. Subjects, objects, art, of naming things. Nomenclature as we use it is arbitrary and conventional. We learn the name of things already named in a training process, misnamed education. We never are asked to find unnamed things or to name or rename things creatively. We may name our children pretty much anything we want. But then we either naturally bend to convention or are told the margins, within which we may do it. And then we confine them to the names we give them. So nomenclature represents not just an order, but also the power that established that order and that trains us to both live within and to use it. Unquote. This emphasis on the importance of naming and nomenclature in Magritte's work led me to think about a particular piece, his 1933 painting, The Human Condition. Magritte actually describes his own painting like this. He says, in front of a window, seen from inside a room, I placed a painting representing exactly that portion of the landscape covered by the painting. Thus the tree in the picture hid the tree behind it, outside the room. For the spectator, it was both inside the room within the painting and outside in the real landscape. But this description does not explain why Magritte chose to name it the human condition. My simple explanation, and maybe mistaken one, is that it was the artist's attempt at revealing the equation of what can be called the continuous cliché we live through and experience. If you remove the painted tree, you will find nothing truer than its own mirror. Maybe the painted tree and the real tree are radically different in themselves, and there is no way of knowing what they actually are within themselves without a learned representation, but the training we have received, that is edification and language, will guarantee that the differences between what we perceive in actuality and our interpretation of it remains boxed, claustrophobic, and limited. I think this is a positive cliché and not a negative one. There are certain problems with the non-creative clichés, i.e. negative clichés. The first problem is not that they contain false ideas, but rather that they are superficial articulations of very good ones. The second is that they represent the end of all that can be said, rather than the beginning of a thinking process. I think the ingenuity of Magritte is that through the simple practice of naming, he makes us think further and opens up a struggle of thought and imagination by constantly confronting us with the limitations of our cliched situation. He pushes us to continue the struggle against it. Fast forward, and we are in March. I am suddenly invited to curate a small exhibition on short notice. I have a few months. I want to experiment with the notion of edification for the first time in exhibition format. I invite Louis Kamnisa to exhibit his 2008 work, Last Words. The work takes the format of 6 poster-sized prints that feature a continuous stream of the last words articulated by condemned death row prisoners before execution. The words express love, parting, and forgiveness, interspersed with phrases alluding to death. The judicial authority in the US state of Texas not only retains the last statements of the executed, but also releases them on its website. The generic text fragments derived directly from the source are spliced together in a continuous emotionally charged whole. Presenting the observer with existential questions beyond guilt or innocence, the formal rigor alludes to minimalism, but the emotion of the text undercuts this elegance. My understanding of this work is also that it has something to do with revealing the equation of the cliché. And this is from the exhibition. As we read the text, why does it have to do with the cliché? I think because as we read the text, we see that basically the cliché that we are all the same is really illuminated in front of our very eyes. But we are also all different in the sense that another cliché appears, that the only actual difference between the statements of these inmates before the moment of execution is their culture. You can tell whether this inmate is a believer or an unbeliever, if this inmate is from which ethnic background, if he's African American, if he's Muslim. You can tell all these details, but at the same time they're saying the same thing. So what do we do with that? That is the question for me. In a field where the whole construction of its existence or continuation depends on the idea of resisting the idea of the cliché, to not fall into the cliché. What do you do if the cliché is just there? If it is not irreducible to something else? And I think this question is very interesting for me. A question that I haven't found an answer to. And thus, I'm talking without reading actually, because it's a very, still something in a very kind of, still being formulated. But I think what Kamnitsa does, and also in the footsteps of Magritte, what they do is they reveal the structure of this cliché. I mean, they reveal how this idea of the cliché works, and they confront us with it in order to open, not in order to close, in order to open a kind of thinking process about it. Entry number 4, the title for this entry is Sovereignty and Art. Sovereignty and Art. This entry starts on Facebook. It's no secret that the excessive frustration, anticipation, anxiety, and confusion of the current political moment in Egypt has made thinking effectively hard for some, struggling to produce and sustain interesting thought. Facebook is a space where this frustration and anxiety can be released and expressed, but is also a haven for escapism from the difficult tasks of structured, potent thought and artistic creation. About a month ago or so, I found myself participating in a discussion related to the posting on Facebook of a YouTube video where the now unsuccessful presidential candidate, Hamdin Sabbahi, is interviewed in 2005 about the Iraq War. Sabbahi is a politician who has been described as a neo-Nasserist. What neo-Nasserism is and how it should be defined within the current political framework is a matter for a different speaker to pursue. But for here, I want to take the discussion the video helped initiate as a starting point to think about Nasserism and its consequences on intellectual and artistic fields. The video is entitled in Arabic, Hamdeen Sabbahi and his defense of the Al-Qaeda organization. You won't believe it. Share. In the video, we witness Sabbahi react in a rather charged manner and declare that any gun pointed towards US Marines in Iraq is good, even if it's an Al-Qaeda gun, and that Al-Qaeda's presence in Iraq as a form of resistance is a positive phenomenon that should be supported. The overreaction to these statements helped me in putting my finger on something I would like to explore further, but for now have some preliminary ideas on that I would like to quickly sketch out. As a response to one of these surprised and appalled comments, I wrote, quote, "I disagree with him completely, but this is the default Nasserist position regarding foreign intervention. Sovereignty is probably the most important thing to a Nasserist. One must admit there is a subtlety to that position that cannot be captured on tape, and that it's not that spectacular when you realize the framework. And obviously this video does not provide the political historical framework where you can do that. Having said that, it is clear that this logic is a form of corruption. All the candidates except one are corrupted through history. The historical struggles of their political positions within the corrupt system of world politics has to corrupt them one way or another." Now, there is nothing particularly special about this statement, but for me, one term stands out, revealing itself as probably the term that most holds the key to unlocking the many complexities of Egyptian art practice from the 60s through to our current moment. That term is sovereignty. In 1964, Anwar Abdel Malik, a theorist with Marxist leanings, describes the then recently coined term Nasserism, stating, "Nasserism, the world itself, an Egyptian prototype of national development, was unknown until recently. It has come to mean that mixture of radical independence, the reconquest of national identity, and emphasis on social progress, which is usually described as nationalism." Now, this appears to be the standard definition of Nasserism. I'm not sure if I can elaborate too much on how this so-called radical independence was achieved, the elements of chance or of world political dynamics that contributed to its rhetoric, and why it was seen to be important for the regime of the free officers. But what concerns me here is the question of sovereignty and its use by the regime as the main currency in the construction of a superstructure of public being and of public imagination. In Jacques Derrida's last seminars from 2001 to 2003, which were published later in 2 volumes under the title The Beast and the Sovereign, Derrida starts with the definition of the sovereign borrowed from the structural linguist Emile Benveniste. Quote, "The sovereign is the broadest sense of the term, in the broadest sense of the term, is he who has the right and strength to be and be recognized as himself, the same, properly the same as himself." But the socio-political manufacturing of sovereignty is a matter of measures, of weights, and to a degree it is a matter of calculated distances. This is all embedded in a phrase that Derrida often uses in his seminars. The phrase, "the sovereign like a god, like a beast." Using this phrase, Derrida argues throughout history, the socio-political space of sovereignty has been positioned in between 2 figures. God, a figure of absolute sovereignty above the law, and the beast, or the animal, a figure below the law, without recourse to sovereign power or right. The relation between the beast and the sovereign thus rests on the operation of sovereign power as a relation of force. In these seminars, Derrida also appears fascinated by the work of the 17th century British thinker Thomas Hobbes, particularly his most prominent work of political theory, the Leviathan, in which Hobbes sets out his doctrine of the foundation of states and legitimate governments, and thus originating social contract theory. In one remarkably striking passage, Derrida re-articulates a metaphorical explanation developed by Hobbes to explain how sovereignty functions within a society. This passage reads, "This sovereignty is like an iron lung, an artificial respiration, an artificial soul. So the state is a sort of robot, an animal monster, is stronger, etc., than natural man, like a gigantic prosthesis designed to amplify the power of the living man that it protects, that it serves, but like a dead machine, or even a machine of death, a machine which is only the mask of the living, like a machine of death can serve the living. But this state and prosthetic machine must also extend, mime, imitate, and even reproduce down to the details the living creature that produces it. Generally speaking, the 1952 revolution can be said to have three stages. 1952 to 1954, a period of indecisiveness, which could have gone either way, democracy or military rule, ending with the latter, after the house arrest of General Mohammad Naguib. 1954 to 1961, the battle for sovereignty as a state on the international stage, the extensive restructuring of the bureaucratic infrastructure, nationalization of key resources, and the rise of the new military elite as the new ruling class, escalation of battle against leftist political forces and the Muslim Brotherhood. 1961 to 1967, the strong socialist turn after the failure of the United Arab Republic. The United Arab Republic, it was Nasser's attempt to join Egypt with Syria. The creation of a single-party hegemonic system in the form of the Arab Socialist Union, the new national charter fermenting the intended socialist character of the state, the slow but sure rise of the reactionary right wing within the ranks of the military ruling camp, the 1967 defeat in the Six-Day War. For artists and the intelligentsia, 1967 does not seem to be the year when suddenly a realization of the non-inclusiveness and autocratic nature of the regime strikes deep resentment or doubt, hindering artists' ability to position themselves within the inscribed conditions. In an article for the New Left Review, he wrote a few months after the Six-Day War, Anwar Abdel Malik describes the main rule that shaped the regime's discourse regarding any political actor from outside the military ranks. The rule being, collaborate with them, absorb them, but at all costs keep every decision-making power in your own hands. In other words, the quest for sovereignty had by the early 60s turned into the artificial synthesis of sovereignty. By blocking out any elements seen as a threat to the original dream of a radically independent state, not by a naive censorship, but by the application of the above unspoken rule. The unfortunate thing for Nasser was that the threat to the sovereignty he was trying to build and sustain through complete military hegemony came from within and not from without its ranks. Naguib Mahfouz, the famous Egyptian novelist, predicts this turn of affairs in his 1967 novel, Miramar, portrayed in a short conversation between two of the novel's characters. One of them claims that the country only has two alternatives to Nasser's regime: the communists or the Muslim Brotherhood. The other character disagrees and states that there is a third alternative: America. What? America will rule us? How? Through a moderate rightist group, the answer comes back. And this is probably what Sadat's regime was, actually. So to a certain extent, the National Charter was the beginning of the end of Nasser's dream of sovereignty. And the point at which the sovereignty of the state began to turn into Derrida's Hobbes-inspired description of sovereignty as an iron lung, gigantic processes designed to amplify the power of the living, a dead machine, etc. What consecutive generations of Egyptians experienced after 1967 was exactly this dead machine, whose fuel continued to be sovereignty and the fear of non-independence, despite there being little of it in the first place. I would argue that artists and writers were among the earliest to realize the predicament of inflated sovereignty being the very raison d'etre of the regime's continuing existence. Abdelhadi Ghazar, for example, is almost always referred to as an artist promoting state ideology. Take this expert describing his famous painting, Al-Mathaq, the Charter, written by art historian Carolyn Williams. Quote, in 1962, Abdelhadi Ghazar won first prize in the competition, the revolution 10 years after, with his Al-Mathaq, the Charter. It is a painting that brilliantly captures the new Egypt and its inclusive political aims. Egypt, her skin, the green color of the resurrected Osiris, and crowned with the emblem of the Republic, stands in the center like a pharaonic tree goddess, holding in her hand the charter of the revolution. The farmer and the worker kneel before her, while behind her the priest and imam embrace. The worker holds a wrench, and around him are machine parts, symbols of Egypt's industrialized future. The fallah, or farmer, looks down at the cotton blossom and the mound of seeds in his hands. Next to him lies a paper headlined "Ownership of the Earth." But can we not read this painting using Hobbesian, Derridian notions of sovereignty as the main anchor of meaning? Cannot Lady Egypt be a body overtaken by the sovereignty machine? Does she not stand so inanimate that she could indeed be that iron lung, that gigantic processes designed to amplify the power of a living or a dead machine? So inanimate is the machine that she does not notice the citizens at her feet, but instead, fully immersed in her own sovereignty, looks into a void, holding the charter and singling an almost mechanical vow. Does not the worker look like he's pleading the machine to communicate with him? Does not the farmer look down mournfully to his seedlings in his hand? Could not the priest and the imam in the background landscape actually be finding consolation in each other instead of celebrating unity? Who holds the real ownership of the land headlined in the paper? But what has brought Lady Egypt to this condition? Again, Anwar Abdel Malik has an explanation in late 1967. He states, The kernel of the crisis which affects the Egyptian national revolution, it was called the revolution back then, and inhabits its development may now be formulated into two propositions. One, it is impossible to build a modern state in the absence of a political class, in the Gramscian sense of the term. Yet this is precisely what the military regime has been concerned to eliminate since 1952. Number two, it is impossible to initiate a socialist revolution and to build a popular state in the absence of socialists. Without a mobilization of the popular masses, rural and urban, and the revolutionary intelligentsia, certainly not by relying on a political apparatus committed to a fight against the left, and by that fact open to all forms of penetration. To put it another way, Lady Egypt is above the law, like a god, while the farmer, the workman, the imam, the priest are all below the law, like a beast. After those fateful 18 days that started on January 25th, 2011, came to an end, Cairo and Alexandria were suddenly infested with billboards, small and large, featuring the Egyptian flag and the short phrase, Misr fawq al-Jamia, or Egypt is above everyone or above all. What or who is Egypt in this phrase? Of course, here Egypt does not mean the state of Egypt including its own citizens, but the state of Egypt without them. For the state has become so mechanical that its sovereignty is seen as something reproducible without citizens. The citizens become beasts below the law. It is well known that Nasser admired Voltaire, so much so that while a student, he wrote and published a one-time publication on Voltaire's ideas entitled Voltaire, Man of Freedom. Voltaire once wrote, "Faith consists in believing when it is beyond the power of reason to believe." Faith consists in believing when it is beyond the power of reason to believe. Nasser and the Free Officers movement used the thirst for sovereignty and real independence Egyptians had in the 50s to construct a social political environment where the average citizen could believe when it was beyond the power of reason to believe. To accomplish this, edification became a major concern. Edification sorry. Yeah, and sorry, I kind of like, I added a part I should have deleted here. Yeah, an excess of patriotic songs, nationalistic ideas, populating textbooks, official TV, official museums, all indirectly, subtly, or overtly stating Misr fawq Jamia, Egypt is everyone, is above everyone. Thank you very much.